This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Jacksonian Democracy. The Era of Good Feelings. After the War of 1812, patriotism and a sense of nationality surged. Henry Clay argued for a new system called the American system, which would recharter the national bank, have the federal government fund roads and highways for a national economy, and continue protective tariffs to develop northeastern manufacturing. Notice carefully that even though the Democratic Republicans are now in control, many of their ideas are similar to the Federalists. States' rights versus the federal government. The main obstacle was a question of constitutionality in the federal government's actions. For example, the Congress wanted to fund the construction of roads, but President Madison vetoed it since this was not in the Constitution. So the Congress came back and argued that they wanted to fund interstate highways. For example, the Cumberland Road. This was okay because it crossed over state lines. Federal government asserts control. Marshall and the Supreme Court. John Marshall and the Supreme Court began to assert stronger federal controls through the Supreme Court. In Dartmouth v. Woodward, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld contracts, bringing this under the federal Constitution. In Gibbons v. Ogden, the Supreme Court upheld the Congress's right to regulate interstate travel, upholding federal government power. Technological advancements. One of the biggest advancements of this time period was the unification of the country through new technologies. The biggest problem was a connection between Western territories and the East Coast. DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, created the Erie Canal, connecting Great Lakes with New York. Robert Fulton created and implemented steam travel, which allowed boats to travel upstream. This cut down travel from 4 months to just 32 hours. James Monroe and Nationalism. President Monroe created a cabinet that included various regions and beliefs. For example, John Calhoun was a strong believer in states' rights and protecting slavery. John Quincy Adams came from the North and stressed Northern manufacturing. William Crawford stressed Southern rights. Monroe wanted to create a united economy and a nation-state, so he began expanding out into the Western territories and creating roads that connected the West to the East Coast. He protected Northern manufacturing while also having the South with its raw resources used for exploitation so that Northern manufacturing would have the raw resources needed for a stronger manufacturing base. The election of 1824. In 1824, John Quincy Adams was viewed as too cold in his attitude and too favoring of the Northeastern manufacturing. There was a four-way race between Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Jackson won the popular votes and the Electoral College, but he lacked the minimum required for the Electoral College. When this happens, it goes to the House of Representatives to make a decision. Adams worked behind closed doors and asked for Clay's support and then promised to give him the Secretary of State position. This was seen as the corrupt bargain. The election of 1828. In 1828, John Calhoun and his supporters wanted Jackson to win the presidency, so they forced a vote on higher tariffs. John Calhoun basically created higher tariffs and then passed them along. He hoped that this would create tensions in Adams' political supporters. Yet if Adams decided to veto the tariff, he would lose support amongst Northern manufacturers. If he decided to uphold the tariff, he would lose support amongst the Western frontier. Remember, farmers hated tariffs. It did not protect them from foreign competition, and it raised the prices of goods they had to buy from the North. Adams had to agree to the tariff due to his beliefs, and this weakened his standing. Jackson won the next election. New Democracy. The original system of voting had had property requirements. By 1824, Western states had eliminated most of the prerequisites of land to voting. Also, states got rid of legislatures voting for Electoral College voters and had more of a direct vote. The new political groups were beginning to form. Democratic Republicans wanted states' rights, and in the North, a group called the Whigs were more like Federalists. Jackson and the spoils system. Jackson came into office as a symbol of the Western frontiersmen. He promised to end the stagnant bureaucracy of civil servants, but he ended up extending the spoils system, in which he appointed loyal followers to cabinet positions. Within the spoils system, he had what was known as the kitchen cabinet, in which his real advisors were a group of loyal and close friends from landowning class that met with him privately on a daily basis. The Nullification Crisis. John Calhoun wrote a pamphlet calling for the nullification theory. Under this idea, states could nullify a law that they viewed as outside of the constitutional powers of the national government. Daniel Webster argued that the nation was a part of a constitutional whole and could not be divided into separate powerful states. Jackson viewed Calhoun and South Carolina as traitors and threatened to use naval force to collect the tariff of abominations. Eventually, Henry Clay brokered a deal to lower the tariff over 10 years, as long as Jackson did not invade South Carolina. The Bank of the United States. The National Bank regulated the amount of money in the economy. Jackson and his supporters portrayed the Bank of the United States as a monopoly of moneyed aristocracy. Jackson vetoed the charter to continue the bank. Now, this could have stopped the issue right there, but Jackson went even further. He then appointed a Secretary of the Treasury who would actually use the army to go out and defund the national bank, essentially killing it. Jackson and the Indians. Under James Monroe, Jackson had invaded Florida and massacred the Seminole Indians. The 5 civilized tribes in this area included the Cherokees, the Seminoles, the Creeks, and the Chickasaws. Jackson and the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act to push Indians out to the east of the Mississippi. The Sauk tribe returned and was then massacred by the federal troops. The Trail of Tears. In order to deal with this context, the Cherokee Indians in Georgia had hoped that a strategy of assimilation would earn them respect from the U.S. They formed a constitution, created a court system, became allies of the U.S. during the War of 1812, and created a bicameral legislature. In fact, some of them even owned their own African-American slaves. But then the Georgians discovered gold in the Cherokee area. They brought suit in Worcester versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court ruled that the natives had a right to their own land. Jackson, however, had his troops remove the Cherokee west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma. This happened in the dead of winter, so 1/4 or 5,000 of these Indians died on that trip.